classmates. Today we will be talking about turning points in American history after the American Revolution. These moments in our history made America to what it is today. Starting with a major turning point that changed the way of life for African Americans was the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists are people who wanted to end slavery. This included people like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, or Isabella Bumfree. An important person to know in the abolition movement is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's responsible for making the series Uncle Tom's Cabin and writing about experiences that plantation slaves would go through in their everyday lives. This piece of literature was read by people in the North, allowing them to learn more about how people treat slaves. And while the South considered these writings preposterous and exaggerated, the North did not. In northern colonies alone, 300,000 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin were sold. This reading led to readers not enforcing future slave laws, and even more copies sold in Great Britain. Another important reason why Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book was from losing her own child in infancy, making her have empathy for African American mothers that had their children taken and sold into slavery. This depicts the story of Eliza, an African American mother that ran across the ice to escape flea dogs and slave catchers in her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Another important factor to the abolitionist movement was the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is a system of abolitionists that work at night to aid slaves to freedom in Canada. Getting slaves all the way from southern colonies to Canada was a tough feat, especially due to things like the Fugitive Slave Act and slave catchers looking out for fugitives in the night. This map shows the different routes of the Underground Railroad. It represents the importance to this topic because it shows how the abolitionist movement was going on throughout America, fighting against rules of slavery for their own freedom. A connection to today would be the movements made to make marginalized groups heard, with people in newer generations trying to make their voices heard and get people to make changes in rules we have now. Now onto the turning point in history that may have spurred a series of events to lead to the Civil War, Bloody Kansas. This political turning point was mainly due to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act basically entitled each territory to decide whether they were a slave state or not from popular sovereignty. The South wanted to use this to make Kansas a slave state as well, so they brought people called Border Ruffians. Border Ruffians are pro-slavery activists from the slave state of Missouri that went over the border to Kansas to vote pro-slave for Kansas. People like R.H. Wilson, a Border Ruffian himself, fought against the free people in getting slaves into Kansas. After the votes came out and were counted, it was clear that the South had made unfair actions to win, but they created the legislature for Kansas as pro-slave anyway. That made the North so mad that the free soldiers drew up a free state constitution and elected a separate governor as a state legislator in Topeka. This resulted in fighting Lawrence, two sides against each other, and leaders hitting each other with canes. It was not time for tranquility for anybody there. A connection to today would be the protests that turned into riots for the cause they are fighting for. A first-hand account that could be used as an artifact for this time would be the letters of Julia Louisa Lovejoy. She sent letters to a New England newspaper and wrote a vivid account for what happened in Kansas in the struggle over abolition and slavery. This is important because it gives a perspective of someone that may not have been fighting due to her being a woman. This may be a first-hand account that was for making Kansas a free state. For the third turning point, we have Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is the belief that Americans had a God-given right to expand westward in the mid-19th century. The feeling of nationalism and spreading to the Pacific Ocean caused many different things to occur, like making Native Americans move westward as Americans went into their territory up the Trail of Tears. But on a positive outlook, The idea of manifest destiny brought on pioneers and more modes of transportation for resources and people to move from their original territory to new land in the West. The manifest destiny also spread the word of gold in California, resulting in a gold rush, all types of people going over to California to make a quick buck. When all the gold had been scoured from one location, they had no reason to live in the town, resulting in ghost towns, abandoned and forgotten. An artifact of this time was the quote where newspaper writer John L. Sullivan made the term manifest destiny. This quote was, "The fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." A connection to today would be examples of having belief change ideas and outlooks for the future. While the belief that we have a God-given right has changed through time, there is still the idea of the American dream that comes into play for people trying to become successful from merit. This turning point is about transcendentalism, a movement for the literary, political, and philosophical thinkers in America. This included people like Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau is an American essayist, poet, philosopher, abolitionist, nationalist, tax resistor, development critic, surveyor, yogi, and historian. He was an all-around noble man that stood for things he didn't agree with, like taxing in his literary writing. It is also told that he gets his inspiration to paint from Walden Pond. This common concept of making art from nature was a part of their art at the time. This movement was important because it allowed people that aren't violent to still speak their mind and express their nationalism in a peaceful way. It also enabled Americans into deeper thinking and philosophy that they hadn't reached before. Quotes like, "Hitch your wagon on a star," kept Americans coming back for more. This philosophy opened up more ideas for individualism, the goodness of humankind, and the benevolence of the universe. This new thinking also made women explore the possibility of individual rights and equality for men. An artifact from this time would be the painting Autumn on the Hudson, and many more influencing the middle class to have art in their everyday lives. This also let more people enjoy landscape rather than portraits that only wealthy people could buy. A connection to today would be the political cartoons and photographs that we are taken to express emotion for a point in history to represent the artist's opinion. These are important because it can be spread through media in a nonviolent way to make a valid point for the people. And lastly, the final turning point is economic. I use popular sovereignty because at the time, people were arguing the topic of pro-slavery or anti-slavery. If more slave states were going anti-slavery, this would change the economic game and how the South would get resources from their plantations. An artifact of this topic would be a timeline of the Mexican-American War. This timeline describes what occurred during the time Mexico and America were at war. A connection to today would be how the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, more popularly known as Obamacare, made more businesses experience bad things while people profited from the act. Actions like these, where there are major turning points in America, will always have one side enjoy it and the other side hate it. So, question of the day to debate with friends is, should Americans have taken African Americans back to Africa? While on one side, it would be showing Americans trying to right their actions of slavery and possibly make the advancement in Africa go quicker. But on the other side, since slavery had been around for so long in America, most African Americans had never been in Africa at the time this was put to question. So, what do you think? Discuss with your class. Well, that's the end of the turning points of the U.S. using the Sprite organization. I hope you enjoyed and have a great day.